Just to confirm, I can be seen and heard by everyone in the Zoom.
Yes, you're perfectly visible and audible.
Can I be? Yeah, it's because sorry. Can somebody send something in the chat if they can hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'm gonna assume that's fine. Yeah. Cool. Oh, just for clarity for people on the Zoom call, the way that we have this set up in order to prevent feedback is that we have two devices, one of which is playing the audio, the other of which we are keeping muted while we are talking in order to prevent feedback. So if at any point somebody in the Zoom is talking, or somebody in person is talking, that means that we cannot hear you guys. So we do just need a bit of use of the chat function if possible. Similarly for POIs, if you guys could please ask them through the chat, that would also be much appreciated and make things a lot easier as well for us. Cool. Arguing that the right to privacy exists is the single most efficient way to guarantee liberties, not just for individual cases, right? This is not just about securing an individual right to abortion on one day, and then later on a separate and distinct right to be able to, to decriminalize homosexuality or whatever. Arguing that a right to privacy exists and arguing it over and over again in your activism, in your court cases, in your political speeches is all part of a broader foundational goal to ensuring that people in your society and your culture and your politics recognize this right. And they see it as so obvious that it does not need to be written down. And it is at that point when you have established such a clear culture that recognizes this right, that you cannot oppress anybody on the basis of an unjust law. You cannot oppress them on the basis of their individual characteristics. You cannot intrude into their home and intrude on their privacy and oppress them on the things that they do in private. And in that type of a society, you can truly say that liberty is won. And I think that that is the utmost valuable goal in this debate. Compare that to the types of other arguments that you can make. The only counterfactual I can think of it in this debate, and please opposition teams, POI me if you have a different counterfactual so that this debate doesn't become a total fucking mess. But the only other option I can think about in this debate is that maybe you would run the case from opposition that you think that we should just argue the individual merits of being able to access particular acts or being able to do particular things, right? Like instead of arguing for a right to privacy to secure abortion, you would instead just debate the merits of being able to secure abortion. The problem with that counterfactual is that it is so limited, right? Maybe you do succeed. I think you're less likely to, but let's say for a moment that you do succeed on arguing that that singular act or that singular law is unjust. There is no transference on that argument alone. You cannot easily use that court case arguing for abortion access to then explain why people should have a right to be homosexual and live freely in society, because there is no neat transference across. You have to make the case for a broad right like this one in order to ensure that you get an overall more free and egalitarian society. And that is what we'll prove to you at opening government. So firstly, understand that this is about individual liberty. It's about the right to have a sphere of influence or a home that is yours that the state cannot intrude on and that nobody else can intrude on if you don't want to. Obviously, there are lots of different ways that you can make arguments for people having freedom and for people having individual liberty. You would make those arguments along with this one. The burden on opposition side is to explain why there is a harm to making this specific type of argument. Note that activists and ideologues and lawyers in court cases have lots of time and space to talk about many things, and they can make many arguments concurrently, and they are often arguments that can exist next to each other without rebutting one another. So that is why it is unfair for them to suggest that we are only making this argument. They need to explain why making this argument is a harm in itself in order to win this debate. Let's talk then about the imperative. The first thing is to understand that we live in a society that it is increasingly encroaching onto our personal liberties, right? Things like data tracking through your social media, things like cameras in shopping malls that track where you go and how long you spend and where you look, in order to make incredibly sophisticated means of targeting ads to you, in order to do things like police work that is increasingly starting to look like it could be turning in the direction of trying to intervene in people's lives before they commit crimes. That looks like things like intervening in someone's life because you believe that they might be at risk of radicalization before they've even done anything wrong. That's something that happens across countries right now, and it's terrifying. So there's a huge imperative for making these arguments because of the fact that you see that increasing encroachment onto individual liberties in general, but also because these are arguments that benefit everyone. Everyone, I think, in this room likes the idea that they can go home tonight after this tournament ends, and that if they want to sit in their room and lie on their bed flat out on their back, completely naked, listening to whatever cringe music that they want to. Nobody can intrude on them and embarrass them in their solitude. And that sounds kind of like, I guess, a small thing, but it is incredibly important to your very identity and to your ability to understand and express yourself, to feel secure in your own home, to feel secure to do things that are not hurting other people and that you are able to do when you are in that most secure place. And that is when people are able to build a sense of identity and a sense of self and to actually be happy in society and live fulfilling lives. It's incredibly important to people. And the final thing I would suggest as an imperative for this type of argument is that, again, the more you say it, the more court cases you win on it, the more laws mention it, the more political speeches have it in them, the more that you start to create that type of society that I spoke about in my introduction, where this is seen as so obvious, you don't even have to write it down, where courts can easily read it into statutes, where they can easily read it in constitutions, into things like charters of rights and freedoms, etc. And that is when you have a durable protection against authoritarian governments, against moves towards crackdowns on minorities, etc. It is incredibly important. So let's talk then about why this is a uniquely persuasive argument. Note that other arguments require you to endorse specific actions. So they're more specific, which means that for people who are not directly affected by them, those arguments are either just not ones that they will bother to spend their limited time listening to, they're unlikely to buy into your broader political cause at all, but also this is uniquely persuasive because it truly does benefit everyone. Think about every single person you know. There is something that they're embarrassed about, some aspect of their identity that they are not comfortable expressing personally, and that is something that they'd probably like to keep safe for themselves. And that manifests in a discomfort when you get, for example, like I get uncomfortable when Facebook targets me with like pride advertisements, because I think it's weird that Facebook knows that I'm not straight, right? And most people would have that discomfort, and that discomfort is felt even more strongly the more ashamed that you are of some aspect of your identity. And there's always some aspect you will not be comfortable with. And that is true the more oppressive the society that you live in as well. That's why it's incredibly important to have this type of sphere of influence where you can truly consider yourself, where you feel free to sit and think about who you are, where you can begin to take the first steps of exploring your identity, thinking other things, saying new things, listening to new things. And that is what gives you the confidence to begin to take those ideas into society. At first, incrementally, in future, more greatly. I'll take you guys, yeah.
Do you think that a moral law that, for example, justifies bestiality is seriously going to be so obviously uniformly bought that you don't even need to write it down?
Obviously, you cannot make this argument in a way that makes sense to justify bestiality, because like, I think people who are proponents of liberty would also argue that animals have a degree of sentience and are, you know, expected to have liberty too. Like you're not going to impede on the liberty of dolphins. You know, no true argument in favor of liberty is going to allow you to do things that would breach the consent of animals as well. Maybe we deprioritize their liberty, but this argument, it doesn't make sense to do that, right? And that's the important thing to understand here. This is not an argument that can be used for the types of evil things that I suppose CEO will try to do, because when you accept that you have a right to liberty and freedom, you accept that everyone else does as well, right? That's why you can't justify this for doing things like manufacturing child porn, because you accept the liberty of children as well to be free of that type of assault and that type of indignity. And it carries across every member of society, especially the most vulnerable, incredibly important. At the end of the day, this is something that transferred to a wide range of rights. It's very difficult to weaponize it in a way that was negative, like CO is probably going to talk about, and I assume OO. And it was something that was increasingly important as we saw more and more encroachments onto that sort of level of personal liberty. Proud to govern.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. Now I call upon Leader of Opposition to open the case for side opening up. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Oh, trippy. I'm seeing myself in the... Cool, I guess. If you hear weird noises, my cat is going on a late night rampage right now, so please excuse that. Okay. Even though we think the right to privacy is on some level important, we generally believe that it is restricted in its capacity to demand positive rights and guarantees for people. It minimizes the notion that the state owes responsibility to fully realize the social rights of individuals. And it also makes people less proud of who they are because they relegate those pieces of their identity to the private realm. I'll give you a concrete example. The LGBT movements for gay marriage and those sorts of rights is certainly important, and we're not going to deny that. but I think it was far less powerful than the ACT UP movement of the 70s and 80s, which demanded reparations for queer people and granting things like social health services, etc., for people who were victimized by a government that was actively acting against them. What do we stand for on opening opposition? Broadly, we stand for things like anti-discrimination laws, obviously, though not on the basis of privacy, but because discrimination minimizes the ability of individuals to maximize their social rights and achieve their greatest potential in society, which we think the state owes an obligation to them. But also, we advocate for things like demanding positive rights. So the granting of social services, increasing visibility of certain groups rather than pushing them saying something is private, we don't want to share that in public. And also granting things like greater social collectivity and the notion that the state owes responsibility to individuals. I'm going to make 3 arguments here. Number 1, I'll talk about the limitations of the right to privacy approach. Second, I'll talk about why the right to privacy is going to be weaponized by socially regressive causes, as it currently is in status quo. And then finally, I'll talk about why the comparative is far, far better. Before that, 3 things I want to point out about the PM. First, it has to be a trade-off. Like, you can't just say that we can do everything on opening government, because you have limited amount of resources. To get massive amounts of social change, you probably have to funnel them towards one particular end. You have limited media attention and support. And also, if government wants to get its benefits of having this privacy right realized to the extent that they do, they have to have that as the dominant narrative to the exclusion of other things. Secondly, privacy is not a guarantee, and hint, people know that. Right? The state still consistently monitors you and has continued incentives to do so, especially if they want to be socially regressive towards your individual minority community. But also, other individuals who might think that people have privacy will probably snoop on you and not respect your privacy on an individual level. Third thing, embarrassment does not go away. You simply push it back to your private realm, to your own house, your own apartment, especially when you aggregate that on a large level. You don't destroy the notion that this thing that you believe is an integral portion of your identity is good. You simply say that it has to be relegated to somewhere private. First argument, on the limitations to the right to privacy approach. The first thing there's 3 parts to this argument. Part 1, it assumes that these things are immoral. Why is this the case? Because you're operating on pre-existing conceptions that these things are immoral. Things like religious bases for discriminating against homosexuality or the right to an abortion. The only thing that the right to privacy approach argues for is that people can practice this on their own and can make these decisions despite widespread condemnation, and that the individual who has bodily autonomy is able to do so. It doesn't take away the notion that we have broad stigma against it. I'll give you a concrete example. Much of the discrimination against Indigenous people, particularly queer people in Canada, the two-spirit identities, is things like relegating their historical practices of non-binary identities or having polyamorous relationships to the bedroom, which means then that these people still continue to feel their shame. They feel less able to share these things about themselves because they feel like they've only gotten that right by advocating for it being a very, very private thing. You're not spending your time, therefore, on convincing people overall that these things are socially acceptable and that you should be proud of your identity in a very public sphere and indeed demand that the state provides things for you. Secondly, it restrictions to the private realm. So what does this narrative actually look like? It says things like, okay, you can partake in homosexuality, but you have to do it in the bedroom. You have to keep it out of my space, which then means that you restrict it to particular spaces, enclaves then that are restricted in their ability to promote their messages, social causes, or identities on a large scale. And that has a tangible impact, which is that it reduces things like representation in the public, especially when lots of LGBTQ movements are restricted to this notion of privacy and instead of being able to demand goods from the state. Thirdly, it doesn't guarantee whatsoever the granting of these rights in any positive way. I'll give you an actual example. In Canada, once abortion laws were legalized, even though people were not criminalized for getting one, the state did not fund abortion clinics on a wide scale, and it's still very inaccessible. The same goes in the United States, and I'm sure that's very true around the world. So in those situations, it's generally ineffective because not only can state institutions deny you, also other individuals can deny you these services. What does this look like? It looks like you going to a cake shop, for instance, and being denied the ability to have a cake. Why? Because the cake shop owner says it's my right to privacy to not see this, to not have to give you this. If we maximize ultimate freedom, it's used in the other way to deny people services as well. That's so, so important, and I can't underscore that. I'll take CG.
No.
OG, hurry up.
Obviously, this debate is not about Canada, where you already have the right to do a number of different things. The point that we make is that in states that are oppressive, you must first establish a right to privacy in order to have the right to be homosexual at all. And it is only after that that maybe you can seek out the additional things that you're talking about. Can you please address the actual context of the debate?
That's actually the conception of these really repressive states. They're going to repress your privacy anyway. They do that through state monitoring, state policing, crackdowns on minority communities that cannot be reasonably the comparative. Second argument, why the right to privacy is most likely to be weaponized by socially regressive causes. Where is this used? It's used in things like gun rights by the NRA or anti-taxation for the rich, saying that it's my private right to have these things and not have them given out to me by the state. There's a lot of inconsistencies that result then for social activists in promoting their messages. First, in terms of things like judicial outcomes. When you grant a right to privacy in the absolute for one thing, you have to grant it to another thing, otherwise you're contradicting your own laws. But on a political level, conservatives can spin the narrative. Why are we granting privacy to these people, but not to our causes, not to keeping our guns, etc.? And the impact is so significant here. It is that the left, which usually advocates for things like state intervention in the economy, state intervention in providing healthcare services, etc., cannot reasonably leverage against socially conservative causes to the same extent. Causes which, by the way, are already more powerful because they have social cachet from being conservative and also are most powerful in most governing institutions. How do we change things meaningfully? I've alluded to this already. We change people's moral intuitions. First, because people are more willing to demand of the state social rights and lobby for that kind of movement overall, as opposed to just getting an anti-abortion lifting of restrictions instead of actually providing the abortion clinics that mean that people actually get those rights in the first place. That's how we increase visibility. That's how we don't make things so taboo in the first place. And that's how we actually get tangible change in the long run. So proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for their wonderful speech. Now I call upon Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case from side opening government. Here.
Cool. Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can.
People on the Zoom, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yep, can.
I want to start this speech by dealing with the two big problems with opening opposition's case before whipping all the material that Jordyn gives that receives limited response. They have two big flaws. The first one is they imply that this debate is one that has a trade-off. Obviously, it does not. The debate is whether this argument is one that should be made or whether it is an argument that should not be made. The idea that there is like some sort of finite capacity to make arguments is very silly for several reasons. Firstly, obviously, there are different targets for arguments. It would make sense that you would use different arguments when targeting different people. Secondly, different groups exist, like social causes are not monoliths. Obviously, different components within those groups are likely to believe in different things and are likely to use different kinds of arguments. Thirdly, like often the way these things work in court is you submit like an amicus curiae or something, just a 100-page list of different arguments for why you should do that. Obviously, there is no real reason why there's any limited capacity to engage in any of this. This debate isn't like this House believes that we should only use this argument or that this should be the dominant argument. It's just that it should exist, or would the world be better off if it did not exist? So that is a burden opposition must defend. That knocks out sort of the first chunk of their case. Second thing to deal with then is the argument they make, which is essentially just that there are some limitations to the argument on right to privacy, and therefore it should not be made. The problem is, obviously, it is not sufficient then to actually meet their burden. What do they tell you? They say a couple of things. Firstly, they say, well, the problem with this argument is it assumes the thing you are defending is bad. That's why it can only occur in private. This is wrong. Firstly, what it does is it makes an even if claim. It says whether or not you think this is good or bad, it ought be allowed to occur. It is in fact taking a higher burden in this debate. Like when I give an even if argument to this team, it's not because I think we're wrong in the debate. It's just because I'm being generous to you guys here. So obviously you can make the argument that whether or not you think homosexuality is right or wrong, people have a right to engage in that practice within their own home. You're actually taking a higher burden, which explains why it is a useful argument to make. The second thing they say is it restricts this activity to certain places, like you can only do it in the privacy of your own home. Obviously, at the point in time where this argument is being made, presumably you can't do it anywhere. The benefit of being able to do it in your own home versus nowhere is obviously a positive trade-off and one we'd be happy to make. We could obviously then make further arguments about why you should be able to do it in other places or why it ought not be limited to those constraints. But OO here suffers from very significant time lag problem, right? They're just like, well, wouldn't it be really good if like no one was homophobic anymore? Sure, but you don't explain why advocating directly for the things you want to do is very useful. Like if you look historically, first it was like homosexuality was a medical condition, then it was something you could do consensually in your own home, and only now more recently is it something that we correctly identify now or be accepted as a key component of people's identity and so on. They don't explain why just advocating directly for the idea that people should be able to like jog in the public park or something is the way that you get any change, right? Because you butt up against like the disgust that people feel in public. The reason why it was illegal was because like not rationally there was something wrong with it. People were disgusted by the idea of it occurring. And when you're right, when your like opposition or your, you know, sort of way of getting those rights is just to say, no, we should totally do it, like it should totally happen, you get absolutely no change. That was not a reason why you should not do this. The last thing they say then is just like, well, you don't actually guarantee that you would get like access to positive rights. So for example, the right to privacy does not then entail that you should be given, for example, like welfare or healthcare. Well, obviously not. This is an argument in defense of negative liberties. Obviously, a different set of arguments would be useful in defending positive liberties like welfare. That is not a failing of this argument or a reason it should not be made. That is a reason why it might not be applicable in certain circumstances or it should be complemented by other arguments. Luckily, in the setup, Jordyn explains to you would be more than happy to do those things. That is the entirety of opening opposition's case dealt with. CO, do you have a POI? No. OO, do you want to defend yourselves?
Yeah, any response to our social regressiveness analysis?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I guess this is perhaps the best part of their case is just like, maybe social aggressives can say, well, like, maybe you have a right to do what you want, but then I have a right to do what I want. And what I want might be not associating with you. Like maybe I don't want to bake you a cake or I don't want to live near you or, you know, whatever. We're totally happy to defend that occurring. Like we think that is absolutely a benefit versus what the comparative is. Would be far more happy if homophobic people just chose to not live near gay people than if they instead chose to like, you know, try and lynch them or something. More than happy to accept that trade-off. Obviously, as society progresses, that is something that can change over time, and we're happy to advocate for arguments to do that. There's not really a reason that gains any ground in this debate. So what were the benefits that we identified for you of this argument? They were twofold. First thing we told you was, it was a uniquely good way of conceptualizing the concept of negative liberty that was more effective than any alternative in doing so. And therefore, it was uniquely effective at advocating for those kinds of negative liberty. Why was it so good at conceptualizing what these rights should be? We told you because it identified that every person ought to have a private sphere of influence around them and an exclusive right to control of what occurs in that private sphere of influence. That then resulted in 5 distinct benefits in terms of conceptualization. Firstly, it was necessarily universal in its applicability because it was something that like you always had a private sphere around you. You always had a right to control what occurred in that private sphere. Secondly, it uniquely emphasized the value of consent in the way that this right operated, you know, like you were allowed to do things in the privacy of your own home consensually with other individuals. You were not allowed to just go around like killing people or something. Thirdly, it identified that there was a public-facing nature of identity, right? It wasn't just that, you know, you might hold religious beliefs or you might express an identity in your head. It identified that often a key part of engaging with that identity was being able to express it in public. Uniquely, this right said that therefore you would have a right to privacy where you could feel safe to express that right. You did not have control around the social conditions in which you lived, whether or not people were racist or sexist or homophobic. But when this right told you that you had a right to privacy, that you could at least exist the way you wanted to within the sphere of your own influence, that was something that was uniquely valuable to people who would not be helped by that other set of arguments, because you could not in the span of like years change the social conditions around you, but you could change this. Fourthly, we told you it identified the importance of control, that people ought to have control over the way in which they interact with people, and that the information that other people have access to about you is something that grants them control over you, and you ought to have control over that. That uniquely fought back against things like mass surveillance. But lastly, we told you it was naturally limiting, right? Because it told you that the place where your rights ended was where other people's spheres of influence began. So you could engage in consensual activities, but you could not engage in non-consensual activities, because that then violated other people's right to influence and control their sphere of influence, which is exactly why this was useful, for example, in saying that you're homophobic and you were disgusted by those acts. That was irrelevant to what other people were entitled to do within their sphere of influence. And that was why it was really useful for advocacy, right? Because it's universally applicable, it had a really good understanding and transferability, and it was necessarily reciprocal. At the end of this debate, this was an argument that ought be made. It was not the only argument that ought be made, but it was definitely a helpful one. Incredibly proud to govern.
Thank you, Speaker, for your wonderful speech. Now, Deputy Leader of Opposition, the floor is all yours. Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Pano, homophobia has become quite sneaky. Instead of just openly arguing that homosexuality is wrong, they argue to not throw it out in their faces. They argue that it should be private, that it should be in the bedroom, that it should never have been something that they have seen, or it should never be something that is ever welcome in the public realm. What the right to privacy argument creates is mass shame, a belief in individuals, and an internalization of some of the most homophobic narratives there are. I want to start off by talking about the comparative, then I want to talk about the opening government case, and then I want to talk about social regression and how it is that people feel shame more so. First, on the comparative, I want to start off by noting the question on the trade-off. So government's claim here is that, you target other people, you target differently. But the difference in this debate is very important, which is that obviously there is a limit into what exactly your dominant narrative is. There is a limit in the amount of media attention that you get and what activists say during that media attention. There's a limit in what arguments you make in legal cases. Government has to accept this, by the way, because the only way you get the full extent of their impacts is for this to be a dominant narrative that is utilized heavily within society as well. I would also note that activists get complacent, right? Like, if this is the main argument that they are pushing forth, it's unlikely that they turn to other arguments as well. So I want to start off then by talking a little bit about the comparative, largely that the comparative being you pushing for things such as anti-discrimination and why that is significantly likely to be better. Number one, because it challenges the moral intuitions of people. Now, government says, but this is an even if claim. But the problem of this even if claim is it concedes ambiguity. It concedes that there was an ambiguity to the question as to whether or not it was morally wrong or right. And the problem as well is that when activists use this as their dominant narrative, they do not innately challenge the initial narrative that this homophobia was that homosexuality is a sin. In that instance, what we like the most likely comparative in which you push for things such as anti-discrimination is one in which you tell people that it was an actively good choice for that woman to get an abortion, that you should take massive pride in the fact that you have the fact that you are queer. On government side, at best, this argument is saying it is okay for you to do privately. It never challenges the initial moral intuitions that people have. But secondly, it keeps this within the private realm. And this is so important. The same arguments that are used against things such as Pride Month, the same arguments that are used against things such as increase in social services or the creation of a gay area within a certain area, is that it indoctrinates our children and influences their decisions. It infringes on their right to privacy. And the problem here is that you never have the ability of governments to show in the public realm the ability of individuals to meaningfully express themselves as well. Why is anti-discrimination comparatively better? 3 reasons. Number one, because it pushes oftentimes the comparison between groups, pushing for things such as saying, there are different different and disparate resources utilized by, given from one group compared to another. Secondly, it creates the respect and challenges the moral intuitions that people have. Because remember, on government side, they become complacent and they unfortunately trade off in many of these instances. Finally, the state gets complacent. The state says, we gave you your right to privacy, and never goes for the other positive rights as well. I want to now talk about the opening government case. There are 4 main problems with opening government. Number 1, cross-applying, as brought up by the Prime Minister, is not a good thing. Just because you are able to cross-apply arguments in favor of abortion with decriminalizing homosexuality does not on net mean it's good, because it is cross-applied to other things as well. Because when it is that the right to privacy is your initial argument, then obviously the right uses the right to privacy to defend a doctor's decision not to give a woman an abortion. So obviously in that instance, what do you do when most doctors opt out of that situation, when there are no resources and no ability for you to get an abortion in the first place, because the socially regressive ones have significantly more capital to use this argument better than you. Secondly, I just contest that this is successful, because so much of the weighing that Deputy Prime Minister uses against us is, at least we decriminalize homosexuality. But there is literally nothing inside of their arguments that explain why it is that the legal cases pass. In most of the most repressive states that OJ wants to talk about, they're very comfortable infringing on your right to privacy for socially utile outcomes. In this instance, all a government has to do legally is to say, we don't need to care about this individual's right to privacy. In many instances, there's so much legal precedent that favors the state over this person's right to privacy. So there's literally no explanation as to the efficacy of the legal cases that come from government. Third of all, the arguments on mass surveillance, we agree, right? But obviously the regulation of Facebook is not going to be based off of whether or not the queer movement supported it, right? Obviously that is not the main clash in the debate as well. Finally, there are a variety of alternatives, i.e. in India, the way in which we pass things such as, I think it was either gay marriage or decriminalizing homosexuality, was arguing for free speech and free expression. In many of those instances, it had nothing to do with the right to privacy argument as well. The key thing I want you to keep in mind for government is that all of their weighing and all their clashing against us is saying, at least we guarantee their basic rights. But if they never prove to you that the legal cases pass, that they work, and there's a precedent for them, opening government cannot take this debate. Go ahead, CG. OG.
Obviously, sorry, go ahead, CG.
You claim things you claim things like anti-discrimination laws and the ban, getting rid of stigma, etc. You don't provide any of these benefits occur, therefore your counterfactual cannot stand.
Okay, so here's where I want to talk about, even if none of these work, why the right to privacy argument in and of itself is still a good thing. Number 1, because the problem with the right to privacy argument is it fundamentally forces people to feel as if their expression has to be necessarily a private choice, that people believe that the private realm is the only place to have this. But the second and more important case is that at the very least, you do not allow for the weaponization of the right. Now, the response that we get from DPM is, it's a good thing that the right is able to use the right to privacy, because it's good people that homophobic neighbors move away. But that isn't the argument. The argument is that you empower actively socially regressive causes oftentimes hurt these minority groups the most. Gun rights, the ability for a churchgoer to not necessarily allow for gay marriage, the ability of a doctor to refuse an abortion, the ability of someone to refuse to allow for services, because all of those are infringements on their choice and their right to privacy. And in those instances, the right points you out as a hypocrite and uses your own arguments against you. And the legal precedents that are set disproportionately help these socially regressive causes instead. For those reasons, proud to stand on opening opposition.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now I call upon member of government to open the case for side closing government. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Fantastic. So I'm a bit terrified in a room full of white debaters with a lot of fluffy English. So I'll do my agent thing with a lot of mechanisms. 2 extensions from closing government. First, why the alternative is much worse in convincing people. Secondly, why the use of right to privacy is uniquely effective in pursuing changes in convincing people that are problematic in the status quo. First extension, why the alternative is much worse. I think here OG was very uncharitable to the mechanisms coming from OWAR, because OWAR shows that there's a trade-off. So I think the question we need to ask is, what is the likely comparative? And I think what is unique about this particular narrative and rhetoric is that it concedes the value of religion itself, but it does not agree with the imposition of that religious value on other people, which means in its absence, what is likely to manifest is the denial of value behind criminalization itself. Why that is true is obviously for the reason that there's an overwhelming sentiment that people have regarding religious texts and how that is unreasonable to begin with. And I think OWAR concedes to this narrative to the extent that the alternative that they push is one where they depict the horrificness of the things that religions do. Why is this unlikely to be effective? There are 3 reasons as to why this is ineffective. Number 1, I think oftentimes religious values, for example, or cultural values are deeply integrated in people's identity. People have been told from a young age, for example, that homosexuality is a sin, or that exterminating life in all circumstances is not all right. So I think what this does is that it requires people to challenge the fundamental belief that they have, that they've been subscribing to from a very young age, which is why people are unlikely to be able to be persuaded. Number 2, I think people have an incentive to defend themselves because they want to prove that they are right and they don't want to be proven to be wrong, especially when people live in bubbles, for example, in conservative societies and don't have imagination over how people struggle over the right or over not having access to abortion, for example. People are more likely to be defensive, especially when you are trying to attack the core of their value, the value that they've been instilled on from a very young age. But number 3, I think this rhetoric is likely to be weaponized by many of the leaders within conservative societies. That is because leaders obviously have a massive incentive to simplify and ridicule you to the extent you make an assertion that these religious values are not reasonable in the first instance. I think the message that this passes on to the believers of these religions, for example, is that liberals, for example, say that religion is unreasonable. I think people would start generalizing liberalism as a challenge to their belief system, and I think they are more likely to perceive our forces as evil and therefore reduce the likelihood of change happening under their world. What does this mean? This means 2 things. Number 1, you can never ever change the moderately religious people or the conservatives under their world, because that's a direct attack to people and the values that people hold dear. Number 2, you would have increased amount of pushback under their side of the house, which means conservatives are far less likely to concede, for example, make compromises, for example. There's more campaign against liberalism, for example, to actively push back against the legislations that are in place. Or is out for those reasons, because I think their argument is that, well, you need to persuade people that these things are bad. But our claim is that people already know that these are bad to the extent that they're liberal, for example. So I don't know why you want to target these individuals in the future. The marginal difference that you create out of these groups of people is particularly low. I think, therefore, what is in contention in this debate is how we persuade conservatives who are oftentimes in control of legislations in very problematic regions in our side of the house, because that's where the change occurs, right? I think to the extent that liberals are pretty effective in majority of countries, I don't think that's the contention in this debate, which is why I think OWAR and their counterfactual dies in this instance. Second extension, why the use of rights to privacy is uniquely effective in pursuing changes. There are 2 reasons why this is true. The first is that you're able to convince a significant amount of people who are currently against decriminalization of things like homosexuality. And this includes kind of religious people to very religious people. And I think this is an important contribution in this round for the reason that OG's claim that privacy is integral to achieving social justice is obviously contingent on the fact that you'll be able to convince people who are currently against these types of legislatures. So to the extent OG does not have any mechanism to suggest why people have an incentive to change this mind, we take over opening government. So why is this true? There are 2 mechanisms to support this. Number 1, it's very difficult to deny the concept of right to privacy, because now you have to justify why imposing the value is justified as opposed to why your value is justified. Note that people really like their individual rights in the status quo. For example, that's why people resent their parents to the extent they tell you to sleep early when you don't want to, for example. So I think by changing the burden to defend on the other side of the house, that is to say, we only forced people to defend defend a world where imposing is justified. I think you significantly reduce the bar to convince people because you don't have to deny their fundamental belief on the other side of the house. Second of all, I think a lot of people, including the conservatives, value this particular right of right to privacy very, very much in the status quo. So for example, liberal education is a thing in majority of the countries in the world right now, but these people assert that their right to privacy means that they should have access to religious schools, for example. They assert, for example, because they're conservatives, that they should have the right to wealth and should be exempted from things like income tax. They assert that things like gun rights is very important because their right to privacy, because their right to security, for example, is something that is integral to their rights and their individuality. I think what this does is it engages with opening opposition as well, because what we're claiming is that they're already using this rhetoric in the status quo and enforcing what the ideals in the status quo by clinging to this rhetoric and weaponizing this rhetoric. So the question we have to ask is, how are they likely to respond when the liberals co-opt this narrative as well? We argue that it is likely that conservatives will act in our favor. The reason for that is because stopping criminalization efforts, for example, there's no real harm on religious organizations from agreeing to decriminalize abortions, because they can still have their belief system within their religious organization. The fact that they can no longer impose values on other people really has no decreased value for religious organizations in the first instance. But on a comparative, by arguing against it, you obviously lose leverage in things like gun rights, in things like having access to religious schools. These are things that are more directly influential to people who currently believe in the imposition of these values to other people, which is why people like religious people, for example, are more likely to side with liberalism, right, to the extent we also use the narrative of right to privacy. That is why conservative people and people who support discrimination are likely to change on the other side of the house. The second aspect as to why this is likely to change the status quo is to expand the capacity of the judiciary to act. Note that majority of countries enshrine individual rights because constitution fundamentally exists to decentralize power and stop states from being oppressive. Our claim is that it's much easier to access justice to the extent you co-opt this narrative. Because the status quo, the argument you have to make is that this is against human rights, because it's difficult to justify that. You have to necessarily deny religious values that supports that idea. But now I think what you can claim is that this is an individual right that is enshrined in constitution. You're more likely to get things like compensation. You're more likely to get things like proper and just punishment to people who enact these things, and that's why you increase the ability of individuals to defend themselves from problematic narratives. We are the only team that mechanized any of the claims in this debate. We clearly win.
I thank the member of government for that speech. Now I call upon member of opposition to open this case for side closing up. Here.
Hello, can you hear me? Hell yeah, all right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The big thrust of opening opposition's case was they argued that these sorts of arguments that side government bench pushes for will not ensure positive rights for marginalized groups. Opening government's complaint against this is, well, at least they get negative rights. Closing government's response is that they don't actually get positive rights and point to what they say are lacks of mechanism. A closing opposition, our extension, is to fill in a few holes. Basically, how we guarantee the obtaining of negative rights far better on side closing opposition than government bench does, but also how we, by using far better arguments, are far better able to get positive rights. So before moving on to the meat of the extension, I just have one extraneous bit about closing government's extension. The rest will be integrated. They say that the alternatives are really hard because what happens is making these other sorts of arguments require challenging religions. But we don't think it is the argument itself that goes against religion. It is what you are arguing for that goes against religion, because it is the case that if the Catholic Church teaches that abortion is immoral, it doesn't really matter what arguments you use, right? Either way, you have to go against abortion. So in those cases, it's sort of zero sum either way. So moving on to the extension, the big part is basically that using these sorts of arguments about privacy are profoundly unpersuasive. This has two big, this relates to the debate in two separate ways. The first is it negates closing government's claims, rebuttal again integrated. The second is what it does, is what it shows, is that this sort of discourse jeopardizes the obtaining of not only positive rights, but also of negative rights. And thus our case is the strongest possible one that can be run in the debate. So let's start by asking why it is that people are anti-abortion or support the criminalization of homosexuality. It is regrettable, but it is a simple fact that a large number of people find homosexuality simply disgusting, or they consider abortions disgusting because they have, for instance, seen videos or pictures of late-term abortions. Or in the specific case of abortion, they oppose it because they consider it murder. So does this argument about privacy actually change anyone's minds? We would argue no, because it never contests the root premises from which people have oppositions to these things, because it never contests the fact that homosexuality is disgusting. It never contests the idea that abortion is murder. All it says is, oh, well, even if that is the case, people deserve privacy. But that never actually goes against why it is that people oppose it. Because if someone genuinely believes that abortion is murder, and you say, oh, well, they're sort of like in their own, like, you know, freedom to do what they want in their own home, people don't believe that you have the right to do murder in your own home. It's something that's profoundly unpersuasive. And this is where our POI of bestiality is a real zing. Because where we say, well, it's just you and an animal, right? It's just you and an animal. Why should the government get involved there? What they do is they come in and they say, well, there's some distinction, you know, there are some animal rights, etc. But in this case, for instance, in the case of abortion, you can say, but the fetus has rights. Or in the case of homosexuality, you can say, sure, it's what they're doing, but it's an affront against God. It's different to me lying down naked and listening to music, for crying out loud. So this argument is weak for two reasons. First of all, because it never contests people's fundamental premises that they use for justifying this. All it is you're arguing about later stage things in the debate without ever reconciling your actual disagreement. But second of all, you're using an argument that is obviously false, because of course the government can interfere in decisions and actions of individuals, and of course it should be able to. They should be able to, for instance, do mental health checks, or they should, for instance, be able to charge tax, or they should be able to like mandate that you wear a seatbelt. So in those cases, you know, it's a pretty unpersuasive argument because it's false, never actually challenges what it claims to. So where closing government says, well, actually, this is a really good argument because it's hard to deny the right to privacy, we say, one, you do, like, it's quite easy to deny it. I do deny it. It's a no. But second of all, it's quite easy to deny that it is applicable, because in the case of, for instance, abortion, you can say, well, it is the case that you do have a right to privacy, but this isn't about privacy. This is about protecting an innocent life from being murdered. And this also deals with opening government's claim. This is a particularly good argument because it's really versatile. But all this does is it shows that it just fails at more debates. Yeah, it's just like a bad argument that can use in heaps of ways. But also, like, we're just not really sure how many cases there actually are, given the government bench has only ever supplied 2 examples, which are the ones in the topic. And so it's like, you know, maybe we just have to make like 3 or 4 sets of arguments tops. That's not too difficult. Before moving on to the implications of that, I'll take opening. Closing?
We're fine.
All right, lovely. I'll charge on. So what are the implications of this? There are 2, and they're really important. The first is that these sorts of arguments that are quite weak come at the expense of other arguments. That is, for instance, if you are talking to someone who you realize is a pro-lifer, you can't sit there and try going through your 6 top arguments, yeah? At most, you can use like 1 against them. And if your 1 is, what about someone's choice? They're not going to be persuaded if they think that abortion is murder. And so that means that you can't use the other ones. For instance, the argument that a fetus is simply not a person and is thus not entitled to the same amount of protection. The argument, for instance, that forcing someone to go through with a pregnancy that they don't want is something that will actually ruin their life, like, permanently, or the fact that banning abortion doesn't stop abortion. It simply leads to more dangerous practices of abortion. We think these are far better arguments than like, hey, you know, you should let people do this, because it actually engages with the reasons that people have for opposing abortion. A similar set exists, but, you know, I'm running out of time. And note the way they say, well, arguments about choice are good because they persuade conservatives. We would note that arguments about choice do not persuade conservatives for the previous reasons, but all of these arguments, I think, are pretty good arguments that you can use against conservatives. But the problem is that these arguments about choice are really persuasive exclusively to people who already buy the premise that a fetus is not a person, that already buy the premise that homosexuality is acceptable. So what that means is people who support these positions are liable to overuse them. And what that means is they're never going to be persuasive, and they definitely come at the expense of other arguments. The second thing is simply using really bad arguments convinces your opponents that they are right. It's not like you have an argument and it doesn't land and they're like, oh, well, try again. what happens is, it's like when you see a really shit meme posted by Turning Point USA, you look at that and it's probably a really bad argument for something conservative, but what you do is you think like, ha 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 ha, look at these idiots, all of my other left-wing beliefs are correct. And that's actually, I mean, it's technically fallacious, but not everyone is like an adjudicator who's on the panel for the prestigious ANU Grand Final. People are somewhat fallacious in those respects. And so what happens is, if pro-lifers see pro-choicers making really bad arguments, they are going to realize, they're going to think that they are more justified in the beliefs that they have, because if they're like, oh, the only argument in favor of abortion is that people have the freedom to kill fetuses, that's not very persuasive, and they're going to become more firm in their convictions. What this means is that you don't get negative rights because you convince the opponents of these causes that they are right, and you pass up the opportunity to make good arguments, but also means you're more likely to get positive rights because the better arguments that you make, for instance, about not having access to good medical care for abortions, generalize to arguments for positive rights, such that as soon as you get your negative rights, you're far more likely to have positive rights that follow. And that's why we have our cake and eat it, and that's why we're proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Now I call upon Government Whip to summarize the case from side government. Here.
Sorry. Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you're visible and audible.
Okay, great. So I will take a POI in the chat. I will take one from opening. I prefer them in the chat, but if it's 5 minutes, 30 seconds, and it seems like I'm not noticing the POI, which happens sometimes, do feel free to voice out. I'd be happy to take one from opening specifically. Okay. Just give me a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, we take over OG, nextly engaging with CO, and lastly engaging with OO. So firstly, why do we take over opening government? I think that there are 2 critical problems with opening government, right? Firstly, at best, they prove why people generically care about privacy, but they do not talk about, for example, firstly, why they care to the extent which they're actually going to care about, for example, homosexuality and the privacy to that. But secondly, they don't talk about why, because you care about your privacy to sleep naked, that translates into you caring about like the privacy of homosexual people to like do whatever they want in their own bedroom. Like I think that there are different types of privacy and people care about different things. They don't talk about why it translates, right? But secondly, moreover, even if you did believe that they proved it, they have zero mechanism on how this actually leads to change, right? They just say, court cases, over time norms will change. They have literally zero mechanism on how this actually changes people's minds and how this actually leads to change on the ground, right? I think that this is something that uniquely came from Tota when we talked about how we shift burdens as we actively tell religious organizations, not that they have to defend their values, which they believe and will not continue to believe in both sides of the house, but that they uniquely have to defend why they have the right to impose that burden and impose those values on other people, which we argued were they were unlikely to be able to do. And moreover, we also talked about how this was likely to be a narrative that uniquely appealed to conservatives because of the narrative of personal liberty that they believe for all the things like gun rights that opening opposition talks about, right? So we think that we were the only team that really talked about like why people were likely to sympathize with this and why this was actually likely to create change. I think that OG is just dead. Nextly, let's engage with closing opposition, right? So I think they had a couple of things here. Firstly, they hit in their engagement to us, they said that, we still argue against religion anyways, so there's going to be no change, right? This completely dismisses the nuance that came from Tota, because what we said was that we don't argue against religious values, i.e. the value that homosexuality is bad in itself. What we uniquely argue against is that regardless of whether homosexuality is bad, the state uniquely should not have the right to impose that value upon other people. And we told you that this was uniquely effective for the reason that obviously like the imposition of values or the imposition of banning homosexuality is not something that is core to religious value. They just like deny homosexuality in general, right? Which means that they're less likely unlikely to avidly, disagree or try to block legislation or lobby politicians to oppose this policy, right? I think that this was a nuance that was completely missed. Secondly, they said that, yes, even if you think that privacy is important, people still intuitively think that homosexuality is disgusting, so no change happens. I think that this is a very good rebuttal to OG. Unfortunately, it does not engage to anything that came from us, because we agree that the intuition that these things are bad is symmetric on both sides of the house, but they're unlikely to be able to defend why they have the right to impose that intuition upon other people, right? We told you that they're unlikely to be able to do so because firstly, they don't care that much. It's not central to their religious belief. But secondly, because conservatives themselves believe in things like gun rights. So if we frame it as a personal right issue, it's likely to be something that uniquely the people who oppose these policies in the status quo sympathize with, right? That was never engaged, right? And their main argument was that, but there are other better arguments, right? Firstly, I think that's kind of nice, OO, because OO's claim was, we're going to focus on this one argument that you should be proud of your identity and that we're going to, go out and be visible, right? Like, I don't think that was a model set out from OO. But secondly, moreover, I think that they have to actually engage with Tota's mechanism on why people are less likely to make these arguments, right? Because I don't think that everybody, firstly, I don't think that everybody knows about underground abortion and statistics, etc. Like, only debaters know about it. But secondly, moreover, I think that they're unlikely to have those nuanced discussions in their side of the house for the reason that the majority of people do not agree with religious organizations in the status quo, right? As in, these social movements often, for example, do not believe, they believe that religion is stupid for thinking that homosexuality is a sin when it's obviously not. They think that they're obviously angry that abortion is banned despite the fact that it's ruining the lives of women, etc. So they're more likely to take the easier emotional reaction of saying that your religion is stupid. Why the fuck do you believe in this? Obviously, homosexuality is not a sin because these are simpler things that are accessible to the majority of people, and therefore they're more likely to take this emotional reaction rather than the nuanced debater arguments that closing opposition wants to run. It's just unclear why they would actually adopt this policy in the first place, right? But lastly, I think that to the point where closing opposition doesn't prove why this actually leads to change or why conservatives wouldn't necessarily agree with this, because to the extent that they still believe that homosexuality is bad, it's unclear why they would, support all these underground abortion arguments, or if they think that abortion is murder, they're probably oh, it's their own fault anyways, right? So I think that if they don't prove why these arguments actually lead to change, our arguments still stand because we actually do prove why these narratives lead to change, right? So I think that at least we prove that there's some sort of change that happens in our side of the house. I think the CEO is just out. I'll take a PR from OO now.
We told you in the most repressive states, the right to privacy is weakest, most likely to be weaponized for socially regressive causes, and don't challenge people's moral intuitions. At best, the state says that we gave you privacy, we don't need to give you other things.
I think firstly, you don't prove why you change anything on your side of the house or what the delta is at the point where states already believe that personal privacy does not exist. So I'm not sure, if that's the context, I don't think there's any change in either side of the house and you don't prove it, right? So next thing, let's engage with opening opposition. So they had the first case about minorities, right? And there are two layers to this. Firstly, they say that this increases shame because you tell these people you need to keep this private. I'm not sure as to why this is true, right? Because firstly, I think that what this narrative says is that the state has no right to impose upon, to violate your privacy, not that you have a certain obligation to keep your own life private, right? I think it says that you have the private right to be as public or as private about this as you want to be. It's just that the state can't dictate what you do. But secondly, I'm just unsure why social movements have an incentive to frame the issue like this, right? To the extent that they want support within the movement for the reason that it obviously allows them to reach their goals of social change. They obviously have an incentive to show this in an empowering sense, saying that the state has no right to tell you what you should do with your life, as opposed to saying, staying inside of your own homosexuality is sinful, right? They don't talk about why it's going to be framed like this way. But secondly, they said that also, I think that I also think that even taking their best case scenario, right? The bullet that we have to bite is that people feel ashamed of their sexuality. I would argue that things like being, arrested because you had gay sex and losing your livelihood, or things like being forced to be a single mother in poverty because abortion was criminalized, it's just a far, far worse impact than being ashamed of the fact that you had an abortion or ashamed of the fact that your homosexuality, because it actually relates to the most visible livelihood that you have, right? Then they said that conservative trolls can weaponize this and refuse to give you a cake at a cake shop, right? I think that the premise of their second argument is that conservatives already believe in the narrative of things like personal liberty and the fact that they aren't obligated to do things for gay people anyway. So I'm unsure what the increased delta is in this case. I'm not sure why calling them hypocritical convinces them in their side of the house, right? Then they said that, this weakens liberal movements because they're going to be accused as hypocritical, and that stops gun laws from being passed. Firstly, like at the point where the NRA is able to like massively lobby things like governments, I'm just unsure why the calling them hypocritical is like, or not calling them hypocritical is particularly going to lead to change. But second, I think it's rather better on our side of the house, right? Because at the moment where religions don't feel attacked, they have less incentive, for example, like be polarizingly opposed to things like what liberals do, etc., which means that they're less likely to, be oppositional to all the types of policies that liberals want to pass. So we think we rather achieve that better on our side of the house. And like, I just think that we're the only team that really have met all the other teams. Fluffy white English, we win this debate.
Thank you, Government Whip, for your wonderful speech. Now I call upon Opposition Whip to summarize the whole debate. Here.
Can I be heard? I personally do not believe in a right to privacy. Some people do not, right? Some people either have a weak intuition that people should be allowed to do whatever they want, or don't have the intuition that you should be allowed to do whatever you want. I don't have a problem with people being gay because I think that that is not a bad thing. I don't have a problem with people getting an abortion because I don't think it's a bad thing. But I personally do think that drugs should be illegal because I've seen them absolutely ruin people's lives. And that's the thing that's weird to me about this debate. Everybody assumes that everyone believes in the idea that there is a right to privacy. But the people that need persuading don't believe that in this debate. And they're people that don't share that moral intuition. The opposition's, the government bench has never actually explained what they need to in this debate, which is how you create a moral intuition from thin air. Take CG's stakeholder, people that are religious, and they say, well, this is an argument you can make that doesn't offend people that are religious. Now, it is true that saying theoretically that like you should be able to do something privately because it doesn't necessarily interfere with you is like a logically coherent statement. But that religious person, firstly, doesn't believe that it doesn't affect them. And secondly, doesn't necessarily believe that you have a right to do things just because they don't affect you. And so it's the basis of the argument is one that is deeply and profoundly unpersuasive to these people. That's why when Mark identified a set of arguments for which you could actually make the argument, but there was actually some strategy that you would be able to persuade a single person through the process of making the argument, as opposed to exclusively preaching to the converted, and he demonstrated that you really couldn't make both, he took the debate. I'm gonna look at two questions. Which argument is more persuasive, and can we do both? The first thing to say, which argument is more persuasive, is that this is about the choice to make an argument in the public space. If you have this moral intuition, you probably already believe that we should allow people these liberties. So the question isn't necessarily whether or not it is a coherent statement that if somebody had that moral intuition, they would be willing to believe. The question is making this argument able to persuade people? Let us see whether or not any team has been able to do that. Opening government has not. And opening government set themselves an absolutely insane burden when they said that they thought that the right to privacy should be so obvious that people would never even feel the need to say it. Because it's never been clear how just the process of repeating that people have these rights or making the argument, the one-line argument that you should believe that what goes on in the privacy of your own home should matter. Particularly given that, in fact, as they identify, it's very easy to caricature, yeah? Like, for example, Jordyn said, well, the reason that, you're not allowed to have sex with animals is because it doesn't respect the rights of the animal, yeah? But most people don't respect the rights of the animal. And that's not the reason that anyone is repulsed by bestiality either, because they think it's disgusting. Like people wouldn't be like, no one in the world has the opinion that the only reason that you shouldn't be able to fuck a porpoise in the privacy of your own home is because it's a fucking like water-based creature, and you don't have a swimming pool in your bedroom. No one has that set of beliefs. You're never going to be able to accomplish the thing that they want to. And the second thing that they say is like, and the second thing that they basically then say is a bunch of ways in which it would be convenient if you already believe that people have a right to privacy, but the set of people that need persuading
either do not believe that or do not believe that the right to privacy applies here. Like, for example, yeah, the argument against drugs isn't that people don't have bodily autonomy. It's that drugs take away your bodily autonomy because they're addictive and they restrict your choices into the future. The reason that people oppose abortion is because they think that it is murder. The reason that people oppose homosexuality is because they believe that it is the symptom of a mental illness and not a choice that you have made. And those rationalizations are ones that have nothing to do with a right to privacy. They have never even considered the reason that people oppose these things. Closing government then repeats these arguments focused to the stakeholder of religious people, which in the first place is a narrower consideration, but in the second instance is the stakeholder that is precisely least likely to believe in the natural law of a privacy right because they believe in the natural laws of God. And so it has never been established why that stakeholder is particularly likely to engage in these sorts of things. Opening.
This relies on the idea that people's beliefs are coherent. Many people might have the intuition that privacy matters and yet not thought to extend that to the things we identify, like that should then mean they're okay with homosexuality or with people having privacy or with abortion.
Yeah, but if you have a moral intuition and then you are presented with a circumstance, you tend to apply your actual beliefs to those things. You know, like if you say, oh, I have this moral intuition, and then someone says, that's inconsistent, yeah, that is not an indication that you don't go like, oh yeah, I was inconsistent. Oh, well, I guess I said that's my moral intuition. Better change my mind. You say, my moral intuitions might be a little bit more complicated than that. Yeah, moral intuitions are unstated premises of arguments. Yeah, inconsistencies in them indicate that you've defined the moral intuition incorrectly. Secondly, I want to juxtapose that to the set of arguments that we talk about. And here's where I'm going to engage with the responses that closing government believed shut us out of this debate. Firstly, they said, well, you're not arguing against religion, but you literally are, because the claim the religion is making is that it is immoral in a way that is communal and implicates you individually to participate in these things. Secondly, they respond by saying, why do you, well, like you need to make an argument in any other world that you're imposing your needs on other people. But the problem with that is obviously that like they believe that you are doing that by legalizing it anyway. So that doesn't change. Thirdly, they say, the third thing that they say is the idea that like people often are ill-informed and so other alternative arguments may be unpersuasive. That is the point of making an argument, right? Presenting people with new information. And that's the only response we get to all of Marx's positive analysis about why every other argument could actually be persuasive. Everybody shares the moral intuition that women should not bleed out in the streets. Everybody shares the intuition that gay kids should not kill themselves because they come out to their parents. But not everyone shares the belief that it's not murder. Not everyone shares the belief that it's moral, but far more people believe that it might be worth tolerating or even accepting to avoid those things. Finally, on mutual exclusivity, Mark gave you a fair bit of analysis here. The opposition did not respond to it. So the only thing that's useful to do really is to contemplate the distance between us and opening opposition. We do three things that they don't. Firstly, we explain why it's mutually exclusive, because the opening government says that you can make multiple arguments. Opening opposition says, no, you can't. Mark explains why you can't, which is why the comparative is one in which you're able to make less good arguments. Secondly, they don't justify their counterfactual. They don't explain why other arguments are likely to work. We do. And thirdly, they don't actually grapple with the question of what the nature of the argument the opposition is asking to make is. We do. We take the round.
Thank you guys for this wonderful debate. As you know, you can get back to us for feedback or like anything to me or my panelists after like the closing ceremony. Congratulations for reaching here. Now you can virtually cross hands. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.